depends on I'm in my road, what kind of tree.
So those that are online, I believe it's time to get started. Does anyone have anything to report? Did you look up your soils and do the homework to see if you have any input on what type of soils you have?
I have sandy loam and sand.
So then
Depends on where you're at.
it's great for specialty crops as long as you can irrigate. Sandy loam and sand.
Most of it's sandy loam, but back by the barn, that's sand. You start
Okay.
digging, that's all you get. I think it was partly one time.
So back on the, our series, and I believe my secretary is going to try to unmute the people that are participating online. We have a couple. But basically, we're on just Fertilize 101. So we're going to just talk about fertility and soil testing. And I even have one soil sample that represents Marshall County. We have somewhat unique soils that we have here, and fertility issues that just happen. Just remember that our soils, our andisols, is the most common one, which is a forest soils. So the one thing we just naturally lack is a deep layer with a lot of organic matter. That's just normal for our soil types here in Marshall County. So that can always be a challenge, is enhancing that, and we'll be doing some of those. We'll be talking about that next week. And getting in the conversation about fertility, just want to remind people about the ability of our soils to hold on to cations. That's more the organic matter and clay in our soils that gives the soil the charge. And we'll be looking at that at the soil tests that I'll be sharing on the nutrients that are impacting the ability of the soil to hold on to nutrients, because we'll talk about cation exchange capacity on the soil test, and we'll be in addition talking about how these nutrients held onto the soil could impact the availability of nutrients to the plants themselves. So plant nutrition, we're talking about giving the tools to the plant to create food for itself and for us. Because the photosynthesis that plants do is what really is feeding the world. Let's not forget that. Plants do not need added food. What they need is the tools that they need to create the sugars that they do. So we're looking at what the plants need from basic chemical elements. The elements are essential for the plant that cannot compete its life. It's an essential element. If without it, the plant cannot complete its life cycle. So like if a plant does not have nitrogen, it's not going to be able to reproduce. So that's really the basic qualifying if it's an essential nutrient for the plant. Some nutrients help the plant to be more productive, but may not be essential. So am I scaring anybody now? Going back to high school chemistry, looking at all the elements. So the ones that are essential mineral elements are green. Those that are non-mineral elements are in the blue. So that's hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And we'll explain why they're non-mineral elements. And then the beneficial mineral elements are in yellow. So for most plants, these help aid the plant in producing, but are not essential. In some cases, for some plants, these beneficial mineral nutrients are needed. Grasses need, I believe, silicon. So in some nutrients, they are essential. And for infixation, legumes need cobalt. So that's not essential for that plant to live, but it gives it its competitive advantage to outcompete other plants because it can, with that cobalt, and we'll look at the organism that allows it to fix nitrogen, it can outcompete other plants because it's not reliant on just the nitrogen in the soil that's available to it. So these are the 17 essential nutrients. We already saw them in the chart. The primary macronutrients based upon the quantity needed would be phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen. And we'll see how that looks on a fertilizer bag. Secondary macronutrients, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, and then micronutrients. So we get from the air, carbon and oxygen, from water, hydrogen and water. That's why they're not mineral elements that we need to get from the soil. Air and water provide those to our plants, and that's a good thing because we couldn't afford to supply enough to the plants to do its job. So it's good that air and water does. From soil and organic matter, we get nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. And then minerals are potassium, molybdenum, nickel, and chloride.
So they say swimming pools.
There is.
That's what they're saying.
So the good thing is that hydrogen, oxygen, carbon is provided by air and water because it would be expensive for us to provide those nutrients to the plants. And of course, that's what creates photosynthesis, that converts carbon dioxide and the water into starches and sugars to create the plant energy that feeds the plant and those that eat the plant. Six elements are found in the soil and used by plants in large quantities. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. The one that is more of a concern now than it has been in the past, those of us that have gray hair know that at one time we put enough pollution in the air, we did not need to fertilize with sulfur. That's not the case today. We have done a great job of cleaning up our emissions so that sulfur now can be deficient and be a nutrient that we need to supply to our plants. Sulfur is mobile like nitrogen, but it does tend to collect in clay layers. So a lot of times it's a little confusing because your soil test, that's the upper soil, may not test high in sulfur, but the plants may not be deficient because sulfur lower down in the soil once the root taps into that sulfur source. Part of the living cells that are a necessary part for proteins, enzymes, and metabolic processes is what nitrogen is utilized for, involved in the synthesis and transfer of energy and chlorophyll. So now that kind of alludes to the fact that nitrogen is very important because not only does it need chlorophyll to do the energy, but the transfer of energy is a part of the nitrogen component. And when I was in college and I was testing plant material for percent of protein in it, we used nitrogen as the tool to determine how much protein was in the plant. So it's the nutrient that will allow rapid growth. So if you're wanting to produce fruit, you want to be careful with the amount you give your plants. You can have a plant stay in vegetative growth if it has excessive amounts of nitrogen. Sometimes people over-fertilize their tomato plants and they have these nice, huge, healthy looking plants. They're not going into reproduction that rapidly because of the amount of nitrogen available. And that's just an example. I saw it happen to green beans once, of all things. Other plants can have their reproductive phase hindered or delayed because of the vegetative growth that when a lot of nitrogen is available. So nutrients like nitrogen, one reason why we don't test for nitrogen in a soil test is because it does not stay put. It's always mobile. Thank goodness we get some nitrogen from rain because there's plenty of nitrogen in the air, but it needs to be into the soil solution for the plant to uptake it. It can take some through the tissue. Yes, we can provide some that way as well, but it's what's in the soil that tends to support plants' needs. So it goes down in the soil. It can be given from organic matter, whether it's the decomposing plant or animal material, or the manures coming out of livestock and wildlife that's supplementing the organic residue in our soils. But then it's released and mineralized into ammonium, which actually can be held onto the soil. It's a cation. But then through nitrification, it becomes nitrates and nitrites, which are anions. So they actually leach in our soil and go down and don't stay put. Or they can denitrify, because whenever your soil is saturated, it's the oxygen on the nitrates and nitrites that microorganisms steal off of that molecule for their use. And then the nitrogen just goes back up into the air once it's released from that oxygen and is an element again. This is what's really exciting about plants that are legumes, is that with that cobalt being available at adequate levels, it can allow the rhizobium bacteria to live inside of a nodule on its roots. And it's a partnership between the bacteria and the plant. The plant is giving the bacteria energy that it can use to grow and divide, while the bacterium is giving back to the plant nitrogen to give it that competitive advantage to be more competitive, particularly in a soil that's low in nitrogen compared to other plants that it's growing with. For example, a soybean crop actually would take more nitrogen if it wasn't for being a legume to grow a soybean crop than a corn crop. Excuse me. So phosphorus is definitely an essential nutrient for our plants. It's involved in the formation of oils, sugars, and starches, transformation of solar energy into chemical energy, important component, proper plant maturation. We always think of phosphorus being that blooming and root growth. Phosphorus needs to be present at adequate levels for a plant to get off to a healthy start. So that's why phosphorus is high in a starter fertilizer, making sure adequate phosphorus is available for the plant. It will affect rapid growth, and if deficient, it will hinder the plant from having rapid growth. One aspect of phosphorus, it tends to get tied up in the soil, so it doesn't tend to move very far in the soil. So when we're fertilizing phosphorus, it'd be good to side dress with it close to the plant's roots, so it has access to it as the plant is getting established. Phosphorus typically binds to soil minerals. Excess phosphorus supports algae growth in lakes and streams, so we want to be cautious with our fertilizer application of phosphorus. So only applying phosphorus when needed by the plant roots. Apply the fertilizer only when the plants are growing, and don't fertilize lawns around the edges of ponds or lakes. We have many lakes in Marshall County, and we want to protect that lake environment from excess phosphorus. And controlling erosion is important because since phosphorus ties to the soil, Eroded soil tends to take phosphorus with it. And we don't want erosion anyways. We already talked about how long it takes to make soil, 500 years, so we don't want it to be eroding off our property. Potassium is another macronutrient that's part of a fertilizer label in the bold numbers that come on the label of the fertilizer we buy. It's absorbed by the plant in large amounts than other mineral elements except nitrogen. It's an important component of helping to build protein, photosynthesis, fruit quality, and plant health. I mean, having adequate potassium can help your plant to stay healthy. It's involved in the opening and closing of stomata, which we didn't go through the biology of a plant, but those are the openings that are in the leaves that lets air and water out. And it's, again, because it's tied to reduction of diseases and many processes in the plant, it's needed for overall plant health. So if you're deficient in any of those first three nutrients we talked about, you'll see visible issues with your plant growing. Other macronutrients that are important as well. Calcium, it's important for cell wall structure, normal transport and retention of elements, as well as strengthening the plant. To have healthy fruits, we need to have adequate calcium. Magnesium is part of chlorophyll, and that's how the deficiency we'll talk about later shows up, is lack of chlorophyll, which changes the leaf color to not green, essential for that, and plant enzymes needed for growth. Sulfur, again, that's part of protein. Sulfur is utilized for chlorophyll formation, enzymes, and vitamins. Turf fertilizers often include sulfur just to help the turf look greener because it's involved in chlorophyll. And it may be limiting depending on your soil type, and helps with vigorous plant growth and cold resistance. So those are the 6 macronutrients. We have several micronutrients as well that are just as important as the macros. If they're anyone that grows plants in Marshall County should know that micronutrients are important, because sometimes on this list, manganese, and we'll talk about it, is deficient, and it can have as devastating impact on a plant if it's deficient as any other essential nutrient element. So it's iron, boron, zinc, copper, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, and chlorine. So those are the micronutrients we'll talk about. So again, boron regulates other nutrients and aids in the production of sugars and carbohydrates and meristemic cell division. When it's deficient, you'll see issues in that area. Iron is essential for chlorophyll, and that can be a common problem in our landscapes because of iron being more available at a lower pH. And if we have our soils high in pH, or even our soils, again, in Marshall County are naturally 7, which is neutral. Sometimes we're deficient in iron just because of the soil pH. But it's important for electron transport, biochemical reactions, respiration, nitrogen fixation. So critical for many metabolic pathways within our plants. Zinc is essential for the transformation of carbohydrates, regulates consumption of sugars, part of the enzyme hormone system, and regulates plant growth. Those 3 are listed together because they're all important micronutrients that commonly do result in deficiency symptoms in our plants. The next one would be a manganese. It's a chlorophyll constitute enzyme systems for carbohydrate breakdown and metabolic end processing. How's that? And this one, again, is because of our soils being neutral and we having organic soils in Marshall County, at times can be deficient. Chloride is needed for photosynthesis, copper, forms of vitamin A, enzyme activator, molybdenum, and utilization and fixation. Nickel allows urea as an end source. So nickel will be more important for grasses that are utilizing urea as an end source. So if you want to see the percent, how they're related to each other, this is tying back to compared to nitrogen, the nutrient that's at the highest level in plant tissue. You can see that indeed potassium is fairly high compared to nitrogen levels, 25%. So for 1 unit of nitrogen, for 4 units of nitrogen, there's 1 unit of potassium in the plant tissue. And then phosphorus, calcium is fairly high in our plant tissue. Typically, calcium is not an issue. Plants grown in soils because of the calcium level in the soils. Magnesium is 8% and sulfur 3. So you can see right by that comparison to nitrogen why those 6 are considered macronutrients. Then iron is 0.2%, and you can view yourself that the others are much less than what the macronutrients are in the plant tissues when it's analyzed. These levels will vary in plants, but these levels known for a plant, it's one way we can determine if the plant's under a nutrient deficiency, because we can actually take a tissue analysis and determine if it's low in some of our nutrients that we're concerned about. So what's really important for a plant to be able to take advantage of what's in the soil is be able to access it and take it up. If it doesn't do that, we're not going to have the plants being fertile. So plants can only take up nutrients that are dissolved in soil water. Most soil nutrients are not in solution. They are tied up, bound to the soil. One reason why manganese can be deficient is because even if we add it to the soil, it tends to get tied up in the soil if we're at the wrong soil pH and not available to the plant. So that's a good example of a plant that tends to be tied up by the soil. And nutrients, insoluble nutrients become available when converted to soluble forms and dissolved in the soil solution. It's amazing. One of the hardest classes I took at Purdue University is soil science, because really it's a chemistry class. It would take a semester to teach the chemistry that occurs in our soils and how the nutrients impacts the nutrients within the soil. So, and that's why factors such as soil pH is critical at times to make nutrients available, because they'll be in a form that's available to the plant versus being tied up in the soil. So the factors that impact nutrient uptake, soil composition, if it is a soil that tends to have more organic matter in it, more able to have water moving through it, or factors that allow the nutrients to be taken up. Soil microorganisms, because they're processing the soil, releasing the organic matter. So we have more soil microorganisms present. Not only we would tend to have healthier plants, there'll be more nutrients available. We already talked about pH, and we'll talk about it again. Just the availability of the nutrient that's in the soil. We need soil moisture present for the soil solution to have nutrients to be taken up by the plant. Soil aeration, we need healthy roots. Soil temperature determines So that's where weeds come into your strategies to have nutrient uptake by the plants you desire, is not having them competing with other plants. A healthy plant can do a good job of taking up nutrients, and at times that's what's limiting the plant to be able to take up nutrients. So this is how really we get nutrients into the plant. We have roots that just happen to be very close to the nutrient in the soil, root interception. So it will just tend to be at a higher level in the soil solution by being that close to the root, and it's readily taken up by the plant. Mass flow with the water, nitrogen is a good example of that. Diffusion, where we need to exert some energy on the plant's part to move nutrients into the plant so that you're creating a release of that nutrient from the soil where it's bound. Just a quick chart comparing how these major macronutrients move into the plant. We can see that with mass flow, that's how nitrogen mainly moves in, but then diffusion as well. Look at phosphorus. You can see that it's harder for it to move into the plant. So it takes more of the diffusion for the plant to uptake phosphorus from the soil solution. Potassium is, again, more relying on diffusion, but because of the amount that tends to be in the soil, we do get significant amounts moving in mass flow. Calcium tends to be readily available in the soil, so that's why root interception is high for it, and mass flow. Magnesium, root interception is significant for it as well, because it's at a level more similar to like potassium in the soil, and then mass flow. And then sulfur, it tends to leach, so it tends to be in the soil solution. So just like nitrogen, that's the main way that it moves into the plant. So talking about soil pH. We're really measuring how much hydrogen ions are in the soil. They make the soil acidic. So when we're measuring pH, it's measured from the scale of 1 to 14, and that's not, and we need to understand that really that as we move from 5 to 6 soil pH, it's actually 10 times more acidic, the 5 is, than the pH of 6. So if you have a soil that's 5 and a soil that's 6, or a soil that's 7, in simple math, we would think that's not that big of a deal. But since this is actually a logarithm function, it actually is a major change. So a 5 compared to a 7 is a 5 is 100 times more acidic than a 7. And 7 for a biological activity tends to be more positive for the soil organisms to have activity at that higher pH. They tend to prefer the neutral 7. That's why legumes like a higher pH than some other plants, because of the bacteria they need to fix nitrogen. But an acid-loving plant likes being at that lower acid because there's some of the micronutrients that are more available at that lower pH, and that's why they can thrive at that lower pH better than at a neutral pH. So our soils tend to contain limestone, which is alkaline. So that's why our soils tend to be neutral if we do nothing. Old soils are low in minerals and may be acidic. Young soils often are high in calcium and alkaline. Actually, they're really old soils, instead of having a charge where they hold on to cations, really old soils may hold on to anions. That's how different they can be. So there's some soils in South America that actually would be holding on to the nitrates instead of letting them flow through the soil. So some of our nitrogen fertilizer can reduce pH, so that's why we tend to lime is soils that we're actively fertilizing will tend to be lower in pH. This is just showing that how the soil pH affects the availability of nutrients. You can see magnesium is more available in a more neutral environment. Calcium is 2, sulfur, potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen. The ones that are more available in acidic soils would be iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. Though boron's more available in low pH soils, it tends to be readily available in our typical soils, which would be 6.5 pH. So you can see the band is still wide at 6.5. So what pH is the best pH? It depends on what you're growing. If you're growing blueberries, you do not want a pH of 6. But if you're growing most vegetable plants, they prefer a range of 6 to 7. Potatoes, 4.8 to 5.5. They do better at as well in disease management in that case. Lime is used to raise pH and sulfur to lower pH. And remember that you never lime without knowing what your soil pH is. Because the soil holds on to the calcium, which causes it to be more alkaline, it's harder to acidify a soil once you raise the soil pH. So that's why we have to be careful not to do that. Soil deficiencies, where it shows up in the plant depends on how mobile the nutrient is. When you're watching plants grow, if it's the older leaves, the older parts of the plant showing issues, then that nutrient would be a nutrient that moves within the plant as needed. So we know it could be either a nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, or zinc, a nutrient deficiency. So it would be, again, the older leaves showing the symptoms. If it's involved in photosynthesis, like magnesium and zinc, you'll get the chlorosis between veins on grasses or between the veins on a broadleaf as well, starting to show lighter color. Potassium, you'll see burning on the older leaves, slower growth and weak stalks. You'll get a purple color on the older leaves. That's not natural. If it's phosphorus deficiency and poor fruiting. And of course, we've all seen issues with nitrogen before where it's the older foliage that's stunning and turning yellow due to lack of photosynthesis. So you can see this on the corn plant. We call this firing in corn, where the older leaves are turning yellow. Excess nitrogen may actually cause some potassium deficiencies as well, so we want to manage that nutrient. Excess nitrogen will result in excessive we already talked about that. It stimulates vegetative growth that may not be productive. Phosphorus, you see the purpling on the leaves. And it could be confusing looking at little corn, but the whorl of the corn is still a healthier color than the older leaves, reflecting that it's the older leaf that's showing the symptoms in this case. New growth is weak and stunted due to the lack of the nutrient. And then we have issues with productivity. That's phosphorus deficiency on a chrysanthemum. Potassium deficiency will cause leaf margin chlorosis or death. So you can see that on that top corn plant and the broadleaf on the bottom as well. The edges of the leaves will start turning brown and dying. Magnesium was a common problem in southern Indiana, where I used to work in the corn crop, which would have between the leaf veins, doing what you're seeing with the curbit here, where you're getting that light color between the dark leaf veins. But the top leaf is actually a better looking color than the lower leaves, indicating that the magnesium has been taken from the older leaves, taken to the newer growth to sustain growth. So excess magnesium can interfere with potassium uptake as well. So that's why one nutrient being a little bit out of whack, excessive amounts compared to other nutrients can actually impact the uptake by the plants. So then the other category, now they're not divided in macro and micro, because you can see a macro is right on top, calcium and sulfur are non-mobile nutrients. So then the issue is going to be with the new growth, not the old growth, because as a plant becomes more deficient in a nutrient that's not mobile, the newer growth is impacted. So like in alfalfa that's deficient in boron, you see the new growth showing leaf symptoms and even impact on the meristemic development of the new growth or the buds. So with manganese, what you'll see again is that discoloration between the veins of the newer growth. Actually, if you drive by some soybean fields in Marshall County, occasionally you'll see lighter spots out in the soybean field. And if you got time to look, it could very well be a manganese deficient plant that is showing a degrade. Newer growth is actually having the chlorosis between the veins. So calcium, we all know about blossom end rot. Again, it's impacting the fruit because calcium's not mobile within the plant. So as the plant gets off to a good start, if it gets in a situation where it's not readily taking up calcium from the soil solution, then that's when we get blossom end rot. And that's why we usually refer to blossom end rot as being a water management situation, because usually our soils have adequate levels of calcium to supply to the plant. But if the plant uptake is reduced, it can occur in our fruit with this part of the fruit not developing. So again, with sulfur, it's going to be and it's kind of hard in this picture, but that's the new growth on top, and the lower growth is the older growth, and you can see it's darker green because this nutrient doesn't move within the plant. So it's the new growth that's impacted. So you see that some spots of plants tissue not being properly maintained usually are not present, but it's the interveinal yellowing on the younger plants that we see. So you can see this is a farm field, and we have this one stripe that the sulfur is deficient in this research plots. We've been researching with sulfur because we've documented that it's limiting in some fields. We're doing different levels of sulfur supplementing. And in this case, this strip is deficient. So iron is another one that tends to show up. It's one that will show up in sometimes our ornamental plants. Again, it's the new growth that's light colored interveinal chlorosis. So we want to be watching for that as symptoms that we may be deficient in this nutrient. So again, it's the younger leaves showing the symptoms. Here's a blackberry that's iron deficient. Again, you look down into the canopy, you can see the leaves are healthier down into the canopy compared to the newer growth. This is a classic situation where we plant a pin oak in our landscape after we lime it to be more neutral because we're focusing on growing grass, not trees. A lot of our trees tend to be acidic loving plants. And this is one tree that if it doesn't have enough iron, it'll show this deficiency. So it's kind of a challenge now because from a soil management standpoint is that we raised the soil pH or maintained it at a pH of 7. This plant's likes more of a pH of 5. So how do we get it acidified? Sulfurs will actually just lower it for a short period of time because sulfurs move within our soils and do not stay put. So they don't tend to build up as much as other nutrients as we apply them to the soil because the soil is not holding on to it. Foliar treatments can solve the problem momentarily. In a real case, someone is having a wedding in their backyard and one of their trees was showing iron deficiency, so they had it fully fed by a professional. Only problem was he did it too quick because it started wearing off by the time the wedding actually happened. So that's a short-term effects as the plant continues to grow and put out new tissue. Manganese deficiency, again, is it's going to be interveinal chlorosis on the new growth. Actually, this is one that I saw being toxic in a really low pH soil because as it released so heavily, is actually being toxic to cucurbits that were being grown close to a power plant, and that was in southern Indiana on a sandy soil, which the pH changes readily. And then manganese, I always walk by people's trees thinking I should knock on their door because red maples and trees will show this deficiency as well as pin oaks. So this again is a tree short on manganese. And then over to on the opposite side is actually red kidney beans showing this deficiency as well.